transition. Sans transition, donc, je passe la parole à Mathieu Petwé pour sa leçon inaugurale. Dear Matthew, it's time to you to speak, if you want.
Yes. Thank you.
If you have to move over there. Oh, yes, it's very serious, you know. Yes. And don't be afraid, guy. Alors, monsieur, le professeur Mathieu Petwé nous vient de South Alabama. Et il est spécialiste des littératures afro-cubaines. Et Mathieu Petwé est l'une des figures de la réflexion et aussi de la préoccupation de la place des afro-descendants dans une région du monde qui se pense souvent comme étant l'unique et à partir de laquelle tout doit se tourner. Or, son regard porte sur l'extérieur. Et Mathieu Petwé va nous parler des écrivains cubains de la fin du XVIIIe siècle et du début du XIXe siècle. Sa communication se fera en deux parties. La première partie, donc sur l'origine des écrivains noirs de Cuba, et ensuite la deuxième partie se fera demain. Mathieu Petwé, you have to speak now, and thank you very much for joining with us.
Shukran. Udi mudakhalati ilah abi Muhammad. I dedicate this lecture to my father Muhammad, a convert to Islam from Mobile, Alabama. I have titled this lecture, The Birth of Black Cuban Literature, a lecture in two parts. Black Cuban literature emerged in the 19th century Cuban slave society that commodified black men, women, and children, defamed African culture, and imposed Catholicism as the official religion for nearly 4 centuries. Black Cuban literature emerged at the crossroads of Iberian and African oral traditions and manifested in a plethora of spoken and written registers. Cubans of African descent cultivated the Spanish decima and fabula in an uneasy juxtaposition with highbrow poetry such as the Italian sonnet and the ode. Bilad al-Sudan is commonly theorized in geopolitical terms as a region defined exclusively by oral tradition. And in the Cuban context, African orality abounds. Cuban scholar Lidia Cabrera acknowledged the Dahomean, Yoruba, and Congolese influence on Cuban oral tradition. She concludes that Cubans transculturated Iberian and African proverbs to the extent that with the exception of religious liturgies, they are sometimes indistinguishable from one another. African aphorisms and Afro-Cuban cabildo songs, those are the religious confraternities, conveyed a system of ethics and imparted cultural memory within enslaved communities, thus enabling African captives to survive in a hostile environment. Though most knowledge was transmitted orally, Europeans did not teach Africans to write. Neither did they introduce written language to West Africa. West African societies south of the Sahara boast a long tradition of written scholarship in Arabic and Ajami, dating to the 11th century. Non-Islamic Africans from the Cross Rivers region in modern Nigeria adapted the Nsibidi script of Calabar to the Cuban environment when the Abaquá Male Initiation Society was founded in Regla in 1836. The Nsibidi script is an indigenous African writing system that, quote, records transmits and conceals various kinds of information using a wide, fluid vocabulary of geometric and naturalistic signs placed on objects, including calabashes, brassware, textiles, masquerade paraphernalia, and wood sculpture, and on surfaces including the ground, the walls of buildings, and even human skin. There are no known depictions of Nsibidi script in Black Cuban colonial literature, but there are representations of the Abacuá Initiation Society in 19th century Cuban poetry and narrative. Plácido's poem, El Diablito, the Little Devil, is about the Abacuá Initiation Society, which uses the Nsibidi script in modified form. Portugal launched the Atlantic slave trade to Cuba in the 1520s, which produced a multi-ethnic African demographic environment throughout the island. Scholars generally concur that most Africans sent to Cuba through the Atlantic slave trade were either Kikongo speakers or persons that understood Kikongo, the lingua franca in the Congo-Angola region. And in the 19th century, the historical period that interests us here, slave traders carried more individuals from West Central Africa to Cuba than from any other region on the continent. But as the old Cuban saying goes, el que no tiene de Congo, tiene de Carabalí. If you ain't from the Congo, you must be from Calabar. There is truth to this adage, because the Bight of Biafra was another region that supplied vast numbers of enslaved Africans to Cuba, many who were Igbo, Ibibios, and to a lesser extent, Efik. But the first African depicted in poetry produced on the island of Cuba was not identified by his ethnicity, but rather for his bravery in battle. In Silvestre de Balboa's 1608 epic poem, Espejo de Paciencia, Mirror of Patience, Salvador Golomon's labor is invaluable. He was the furious lion, tamed by his master, whose vigor could be unleashed in the interest of the fledgling Spanish colony. I cite in Spanish, and later I will translate into English. Andaba entre los nuestros diligente un etíope digno de alabanza, llamado Salvador, negro valiente, de los que tiene yara en su labranza, hijo de Golomón, viejo prudente, el cual armado de machete y lanza, cuando vido a Gilberto anda brioso, arremete contra él cual león furioso. Walking amongst us a diligent Ethiopian man, worthy of praise, known as Salvador, the valiant black man, among those that Yara boasts in her farmland, son of Golomon, an old wise man, who armed with a machete and a lance, when he saw Gilberto, he was moved by courage. He lunged at him like a furious lion. Golomon's feat bespeaks his acumen and military prowess, but it is his loyalty to his Spanish enslaver that Silvestre de Balboa so enthusiastically commends. Salvador's victory is not his own, since he wielded power as a proxy for the Spanish Empire. We have an example of the black man working in the service of white Spanish power. As an enslaved man, Salvador Golomon was conscripted into a military tradition that had been established nearly a decade earlier. In 1600, the governor of Havana organized a militia of 100 free mulattoes after Francis Drake attacked the capital in 1586. Their military service was instrumental to the Spanish Empire because black and mulatto militias put down anti-slavery revolts and repelled foreign adversaries, as in the 1762 British siege of Havana. But free black militiaman Jose Antonio Aponte disrupted the subordinate relationship that black men had to the Spanish crown when he conspired to overthrow the Spanish government and abolish slavery in 1812. Hampâté created an enigmatic book of drawings, un libro de pinturas, depicting Mars, the Roman god of war, black Moorish armies, and the triumphant black soldiers in Marianao, Cuba. In light of this, I contend that the birth of black Cuban literature is defined by three primary features: autodidacticism as an epistemological practice, the ongoing tensions between assimilation and militancy, and lastly, the sporadic representation of African-inspired religion. In 1789, Afro-Cuban poet Santiago de la Barrera published an ode to Carlos IV, the King of Spain. De la Barrera was an autodidact who produced one of the earliest known Afro-Cuban lyrical expressions in the Hispanophile tradition of the 18th century. Nearly 3 decades later, an Afro-Cuban published poetry that would openly reflect Cuban social reality. That Afro-Cuban was a woman. That poet was a free woman of African and European ancestry called Juana Pastor. Pastor mastered Latin to the extent that she became a professor for white aristocratic women in colonial Havana. Her 1815 Décima and her sonnet, published merely 3 years after Hampânté's insurgency was exposed, bear no resemblance to his counter-hegemonic theories. Neither do they reflect black Cuban militancy. Rather, Pastor is singularly concerned with the pervasive nature of paternalism in Cuban slave society that dictated gender norms for the female body. My brief analysis of the Décima below demonstrates Pastor's critique of white Christian patriarchy in Cuban slave society. I will read the Spanish first and then the English translation. Compadezco del impío, me lastimo del inepto, doy incienso al predilecto y del soberbio me río, también sagaz me desvío del grosero rasgador, que infiero viole mi honor, mas siempre con fe sencilla, por saber soy su costilla, que fuerza le tenga amor. I pity the godless man, lament the incompetent fellow, flatter the favored, laugh at the haughty. Wise, I also despise the vulgar man who dares violate my honor. But I always know by faith that I am his rib and that I must love him. End quote. Biblical references feature prominently in Pastor's few surviving poems. In the book of Genesis, God created Adam first. Then he formed Eve from Adam's rib. In this way, the book of Genesis portrays women as a derivative of the masculine principle. But the biblical narrative contradicts biological science because men are born of women. Pastor is sensitive to the aspersions cast upon her because rumor had the discursive power to dishonor a reputable woman of African descent. Though Spanish Catholicism lauded the image of the Virgin Mary in Cuba as the Mother of God, la Madre de Dios, Pastor seemed more concerned with how biblical discourse constructed masculinity as the principle that governed Cuban colonial society. Pastor is critical of biblical discourse, even though she relies on the Bible to portray herself as a morally superior to the godless man she pities, quote, end quote. Masculinity was a recurring theme in Black Cuban literature and became a leitmotif in the works of some authors. Cuba holds a unique place in the annals of Latin American literary history because it produced a sizable number of enslaved poets in the 19th century. These include Juan Francisco Manzano of Havana, Ambrosio Echemendia from Trinidad, Nestor Cepeda, Juan Antonio Frias, and Manuel Roblejo from Camagüey, and José de Carmen Díaz from the small town of Guines, all literary authors, poets who were held in bondage. Cuban-American scholar William Lewis correctly asserts that Juan Francisco Manzano's autobiography, the only autobiographical account by an enslaved person in Spanish America, represents the birth of Cuban narrative. But while William Lewis insists that Manzano abandoned his African frame of reference to partake in elite literary practices, my book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, argues that Manzano camouflaged African spirituality as Catholicism, Romanticism, and Neoclassicism. Manzano primarily depicts African spirituality in three important ways. Dreams appear as a portal to the spirit world. The forest and wilderness is a tabernacle to perform ritual, as in the Bakongo tradition of the Kingdom of Congo. And the crossroads appears as a space of possibility and pain. After the precipitous death of Manzano's mother, Maria del Pilar, circa 1816, Manzano found himself at the crossroads between freedom and slavery, life and death, creative genius or the compulsory silence of the plantation. Manzano was baptized Catholic, but his family also socialized him into African spirituality through proverbs and a belief in spirit presence. Manzano was situated between two bodies of knowledge, one determined by Afro-Caribbean oral tradition and another codified in Western literature, as Josiana Arroyo Martinez says in her work. Manzano sought to liberate himself rather than place his faith in the Christian notion of redemption. Manzano transculturated Catholic notions of sainthood with Yoruba, Nigerian spiritual concepts when he appealed to the saints to escape the plantation. In Spanish, from Manzano's slave narrative, completed circa 1836, prior to the work of African-American Frederick Douglass, who published in 1845. Todavía creo que ellos me depararon la ocasión y me custodiaron la noche de mi fuga de matanzas, the saints. Para La Habana, como veremos pues, tomando el almanaque, y todos los santos de aquel mes eran rezados por mí diariamente. I still believe that they, the saints, afforded me the occasion and watched over me the night of my escape from Matanzas to Havana, as we shall see. Taking up the almanac, all the saints of that month were prayed daily by me. Manzano says again regarding his relationship to the saints who in Cuba have been transculturated with Nigerian divine spirits known as orishas. Pues llegaba hasta tal punto mi confianza que pidiendo al cielo suaviase mis trabajos, me pasaba casi todo el tiempo de la prima noche rezando cierto número de Padres Nuestros y Ave Marías a todos los santos de la corte celestial, para que el día siguiente no me fuese tan nocivo como el que pasaba si me acontecía algunos de mis comunes y dolorosos apremios, lo atribuía solamente a mi falta de devoción o al enojo de algún santo que había echado en olvido para el día siguiente. My confidence reached such a point that beseeching the heavens to lighten my load, I spent nearly the entire early evening praying a certain number of Our Fathers and Hail Marys to the saints in the heavenly hosts, so that the next day would not be as adverse as the last. If some common and painful pressures befell me, I only attributed them to my lack of devotion or to the anger of some saint whom I had forgotten for the next day. Manzano's attempt to appease the wrath of the saints, Saint Anthony or San Antonio, chief among them, implied a belief in the paradoxical nature of divine entities, something incompatible with Catholic doctrine, but consistent with Yoruba concepts of the spirit world. Solimar Otero explains that the crossroads enable disparate religions to converge within common space, but the linking of these symbolic worlds, which are sometimes in conflict with one another, is possible because of Eshu, or Echu Elegua in Cuba, the master of the crossroads. This is from the work of Toyin Falola. Eshu is not the embodiment of evil, and he has no conceptual parallel in Christianity, but Eshu has been associated with and transculturated with San Antonio in Cuban religious traditions. Falola contends that Eshu acknowledges both good and evil as useful, universal forces. Manzano credited the saints, not Jesus Christ, with his successful escape from the plantation. In fact, scholars demonstrate that Africans and their descendants transculturated Catholic saints with Yoruba orishas as a convenient facade for their core beliefs, because all forms of African religion were forbidden throughout the Spanish Empire. Yet another instance of African spirituality appears in Manzano's poems, Un sueño a mi segundo hermano, published in 1838 after he was manumitted, A Dream for My Second Brother in English, consisting of 47 stanzas. I won't share all 47 stanzas today for the sake of time. In A Dream, Manzano escapes to the forested wilderness to find a refuge from slavery and a sacred space where he might conjure the power of the dead. Manzano depicts himself as a maroon in the forested wilderness, known in Cuba Spanish as El Monte. This representation is inconsistent with the locus amenus trope in European literature, but it is compatible with Afro-Cuban ideas about the wilderness as the epitome of the sacred and Bakongo spiritual tradition of pre-colonial Congo kingdom. In A Dream, Manzano metamorphoses into a bird and lands in the center of the earth. I quote in Spanish first. Recojo los plumajes, inclino un poco el pecho, en círculo rodando, torno a bajar de nuevo, descendiendo continuo de matanzas al seno, donde yertos reposan los miserables restos de aquellos nuestros padres, que el primer ser nos dieron. Quote, I gather my feathers, I slightly tilt my chest, and turning in circles I come down again in a well-aimed descent with my bosom towards Matanzas. There lie resting the miserable remains of our parents who gave us our first being. We should pay attention to his reference to mortal remains, which are key to traditional Congo religion, as well as the notion of our first being, which leaves the impression that there is a second existence. Manzano's depiction of a maroon represented an aesthetic novelty in Black Cuban literature, and it was a departure from Spanish Catholicism that advocated redemption without freedom. Enslaved Black Cuban poets not only managed to publish in white-owned newspapers, but some like José del Carmen Díaz also published in the Black Cuban press, which was founded in 1842 by Antonio Medina. The second generation of enslaved Black Cuban lyricists typically used conventional literary tropes, but they protested Cuban slavery in poems such as El Esclavo, the Slave, by Manuel Roblejo, and The Cemetery on the Sugar Plantation, El Cementerio del Ingenio, a lamentation written, again, in décimas by José del Carmen Díaz. Díaz addressed the problem of white male sexual violence against Black women, but also constructed textual silences in his poetry to safeguard Black female honor. This is akin to the work of Juana Pastor, 1815. Although African spirituality is seldom portrayed in their verses, the second generation of enslaved poets, their political commitment to Black liberation did not diminish. Manuel Roblejo and Juan Antonio Frias took up arms and gave their lives in the first Cuban War for Independence, which was fought between 1868 and 1878. It was a struggle that sought political independence from Spanish colonialism and the abolition of slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Professeur Mathieu. Merci beaucoup pour ce tour dans une île où la littérature s'est camouflée. Et la littérature d'origine africaine s'est camouflée dans une forme de littérature romanistique, si je puis dire, où le catholicisme n'était qu'une valeur d'apparence et que l'Afrique était une valeur de refuge. Cette valeur de refuge nous a été présentée à travers les œuvres de Manzano, certes, mais aussi de Pastor, pour montrer comment du Congo au Nigeria jusqu'au voyage prétendument sans retour, il y a eu une présence d'une fibre plus qu'africaine et où le principe de virilité ou de masculinité, comme vous dites, n'était qu'une façon aussi de retrouver un peu la trace de cet ancêtre qu'on a évoqué tout à l'heure. Merci beaucoup pour le genre autobiographique qui rentre en littérature et qui y reste toujours comme étant un genre qui à la fois rappelle les lieux d'où l'on vient, qui parle des personnes identifiées et incarnées, mais qui évoque surtout l'absolue nécessité de repasser les plats par l'univers et de la mémoire et des traditions que l'on a connues et de ce que l'on veut perpétuer ou revisiter. Merci beaucoup, professeur Mathieu. Maintenant, on va